I'll never forget the first time I fired a gun. I was about 11 years old, and it was a .22 caliber rifle that belonged to my cousin Peter, who was about 20 years older than me. He was teaching my brother John and I to shoot at a target that he had set up in a sort of abandoned quarry near where he lived in Shrewsbury, about 40 miles west of here. Peter worked for the Massachusetts Commission on Fisheries and Wildlife, and he was unlike most of the adult men that I knew. He hunted and fished and still played hockey in a league. Earlier that same weekend, he had taught me to bait a hook. Now I braced the butt of the rifle against the inside of my shoulder and squeezed the trigger. I felt the gun kick back against me. I was a bit nearsighted and couldn't see that much very well. "What happened? Did I hit it?" "No, Patrick, you did much better," said Peter. "You hit Shrewsbury." I recall that day well about 15 years later, in the winter of 1990. When while at work, I received a phone call from my mother telling me that Peter had been killed. He had been shot by a colleague, another state biologist, in his office in the Commission. This colleague was an ill and suffering person, as you might have guessed. When apprehended, according to later testimony, he was attempting, in vain, to revive my cousin on the office floor. I won't go too much into detail with you this morning about the criminal case that unfolded, about the effect this loss had on different members of my extended family. Speaking personally, however, it came in such a dark season in my life. A stretch of years when I seemed to be going to funerals so often. The early 1990s. Men older than me, friends, mentors, people Peter's age, so many dying from HIV and AIDS. I lived, I understand now, at that time as someone who was so deeply terrified of death. A year ago this past August, I came across a story in a western suburban newspaper. A house in a bordering town had been sold and was being renovated, a down-to-the-studs renovation. The house, by chance, had been lived in, had belonged to the mother of the man who shot my cousin. In ripping down the walls, workmen discovered a gun and a great deal of ammunition. Time changes how we view things, of course. But I remember reading that story and thinking a lot, perhaps in a new way, about this man who had taken my cousin's life. About two lives that ended that February morning in 1990. About a mind that would stockpile in this way. A hedge, a safeguard, against what encroaching danger? Against the specter of what struggle or threat of death? All of this is so long ago now, but I share this story with you in the spirit of full disclosure. We have been and will find ourselves in coming weeks in a season of remembrance. September marked the one-year anniversary of the shooting death of Jorge Fuentes, 19 years old, a parishioner at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church, just blocks from here. A young person I got to know well in the course of 3 summer mission trips. Weeks from now, our nation will observe the one-year anniversary of the shooting deaths of 28 people, mostly young children, in Newtown, Connecticut. All of these losses were very much present to me this past September, when with a number of Trinity parishioners and other members of the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, I went to the State House to witness and participate in a day-long series of testimonials before the Commonwealth's Joint Committee on Public Safety and Homeland Security. This is the committee charged with assessing, prioritizing the more than 35 separate legislative proposals that have been put forward this past year in the area of gun control and public safety. It was an unforgettable day. Mayor Menino was there, Governor Patrick was there, Bishop Shaw was there, as were many members of this parish, members of Temple Emmanuel, and many, many people who are opposed to any legal constraints to gun ownership and use. I was not aware until going to the State House that day of just how busy legislators have been in the past year. There are all manner of bills for assessment and consideration. A bill outlawing the sale of body armor in the Commonwealth. A bill limiting the frequency of legal gun sales. A bill intended to reduce the number of cartridges in an automatic weapon from 10 to 7. Each of these bills has sponsors and supporters, and each has opponents. Much of what I heard that day honestly mystified me. At one point, I leaned over and sort of hissed in the ear of one of your fellow parishioners, 10 to 7? Why not 10 to 0? This wise and dedicated woman, without taking her eyes off the speaker at that moment, inclined her head towards me and said, Patrick, it's about circuitry. Some of them are just wired differently than you and me. Well, I think there may be some truth to that. As I've continued to pray and to think this fall about this enormous issue of violence in our culture, I've wondered too if all of we pros and all of we cons do not stand on some sort of common ground. A common ground of fear. In World War Z, one of this summer's blockbuster movies, and one of a seemingly endless stream of films about zombies and the pending end of days, I watched as Brad Pitt prepared himself for a battle with the deadly invaders. In one scene, he makes a sort of armor by wrapping his wife's thick fashion magazines around his forearms and lashing it all together with duct tape. Now, I don't mean to suggest at all that gun rights advocates believe that the zombies are coming. But films like World War Z and Contagion and Elysium and White House Down aim into a consumer market, aim into an audience that's jittery. Jittery about government shutting down, jittery about the possibility of rising sea levels, jittery about financial anxiety and growing separation between economic classes. These fears are real and serious, but they are also the sort of soft soil of common fear in where these films find their markets. And as I watched Brad Pitt suit himself up for battle, I thought, of course. Some are convinced that those 3 extra rounds in the magazine will make some sort of difference on some future dark day. That these fears are real. Does not mean that the legislation they inspire, however, is not having disastrous consequences. African Americans and white Americans seemed to be speaking past each other so much this past year in the wake of George Zimmerman's acquittal. In a nation where there are more guns than people, in a nation where most guns are owned by white people, in a culture where many are fearful of African American teenagers wearing sweatshirts with hoods, stand your ground laws are pitched towards the exculpation of one demographic and the decimation of another. We are talking, of course, about violence with impunity. But I'd like to suggest that under the violence we are standing on the common ground, that our feet are mired in the common mud of fear. Did you happen to catch the words of the Deuteronomist this morning? Keep these words, we heard. Bind them as a sign on your hand, O Israel. Strap them to your forehead. Write them on your doorposts and on your gates. If you have ever seen an Orthodox Jewish male at prayer, perhaps you have noticed how the words of the Shema, the passage we heard this morning, are lived into and prayed into. Strapped to the forehead, strapped to the left hand, two small cube-shaped leather boxes called tefillin. Tefillin, each containing 4 passages of Scripture handwritten on parchment. 2 are from Exodus 13, the redemption of Israel, the dedication of the firstborn, and 2 are from Deuteronomy, this morning's reading, and a later passage about the promised land. Reminders, physical, palpable reminders of God's care. Reminders that God's love, abiding from generation to generation, is stronger than death. Tefillin, a physical manifestation of that great image from Paul's letter to the Romans that informs the opening collect for this morning, the first Sunday of Advent. Put on the armor of light. Remind yourself of God's abiding love for you and for each of God's children, that you and all are made by God, beloved of God, and that while you are prey to evil and to death, evil and death are powerless to script the ultimate meaning of the lives of those who love God and love neighbor. Fear not, is the reminder, handwritten and tightly rolled in those 2 small boxes. I am with you. I will transfigure your fear. What are you afraid of? What are you afraid of? That might seem like an odd question to pose on this, the first morning of Advent. But Advent, the coming of Christ among us, is all about our liberation. Liberation from violence and the misuse of power. Liberation from terror and fear of death. So I offer this question to you as a liberating question. So often our fears are like fog or darkness. They can falsify the shape of all they envelop. But when you pin down fear with that one bold question, what's frightening you has a way of shrinking down to a proportion that you can actually engage. What are you afraid of? What are we afraid of? To ask that question is to grab back some of the power we have invested in anything that frightens us. It draws our fear out from the night and fog of the unknown in which every fear lives. When we can name our fears, they begin to diminish. To ask that question is to light a candle in the darkness. Cast away the works of darkness, says Paul, and put on the armor of light. It's Advent again. What better time to put on something new?